Perry. I'm a professor and the Department Chair of Government and Politics at Utica College. And as the title suggests, I'm going to talk to you today, with you, a little bit about blogging, which is something that a year ago I was not involved in. I didn't have a smartphone that I used actively. I didn't have social media accounts. And long story short, all that has changed rapidly over the last year. So I'll talk a little bit about how that changed for me quickly, but I don't want to dominate the conversation. And then I'll talk a little bit about why blogging can be useful, potentially, to you as aspiring academic professionals, and how, if you're interested in doing that, you can go about it, both in terms of general considerations as well as some practical suggestions for getting from A to B in a way that's workable. So, the first thing I'll mention is that when I remember being in your position, there were a number of professors. I went to the University of Massachusetts, that's where I got my PhD in political science, that were really encouraging me to get involved actively with research, right? Do my own research, come up with my own ideas, not only go to conferences and present there, which I began doing as a graduate student. How many people of you have done that, presented at professional conferences? Some of you, good. It's a great learning opportunity to sort of work your way into professional writing, as you may know. And I found that very confusing, right? Because when I got to graduate school, I realized that there was a whole lot that I needed to learn. I was surrounded by not only professors who knew a lot more than I do, but also graduate students who knew a lot more than I did. So the whole idea of me doing my own research was really kind of quite intimidating. But as time went on and my career unfolded, right? I pushed, one thing led to another, published articles, published books, did all that type of stuff that you would associate with being an active researcher in whatever field you may be from. And I kind of reached a point after several years where that was great. It opened a lot of doors. For instance, I learned that most people don't actually read your book, right? They're impressed that you've written one. They compliment you on it. You get invited to talk about stuff all over the world, but most people haven't actually read it. Except for a small set of scholars who are focused on that area. And I think we can all probably relate to that in regards to our given fields. And at a certain point I thought to myself, is that really the best use of my time, right? Particularly in political science, my field, particularly in terms of American politics, which has been my focus over the last several years, right? There's been a disconnect between what experts in the field are researching and finding and doing and how politicians and citizens are processing information and making related decisions. So I got a little disenchanted with publishing because it was a lot like writing a dissertation in some ways. You jump through a bunch of hoops, right? And at the end, you get there, and then there's not really, maybe you're not at the session where you learn how to turn your dissertation into a book, but if you don't, like me, it just kind of sits there and maybe you spit it off into some articles, maybe you don't. So anyhow, I came to this idea of what we call public discourse in political science from an interest in service, taking my expertise and the opportunities I've had and tried to share it with a broader audience, right? And also an interest to actually have all the stuff I've been working on be read by more than just a small set of people who are really interested and really in tune with these types of things. So how did that happen? Well, it's another lesson in terms of thinking about your career and how to move ahead. It was a funny story. Last summer, as you know, both national party conventions in American politics were quite interesting, right? The Republican one, the Democratic one. There's a lot of political drama there. The Republican one might have been a contested convention, which really doesn't happen. So I thought to myself, it'd be pretty nice to get into the conventions, particularly this year, which I had never done, so I could see what's going on firsthand and talk to people. And really the only way you can do that is to have a media credential or to be a member of one of the two parties and work your way into a delegate status. Neither of those were things that I had at the time, right? So I had done over the last 5 years at Utica College different television interviews for WKTV, which is our regional CBS and NBC affiliate, right? You know, something comparable in Syracuse. I don't know where it is offhand. So I knew them, they knew me. I'd been in the studio several times providing commentary, and I had this idea. If I would volunteer to go down to the conventions, right, and report for them, maybe they would help me get a credential, right? And they said, sure, you want to work for free? By all means, we'll apply for a credential. And then I went to my college, because I didn't want to pay for this out of pocket, and said, hey, I got this idea, WKTV, which is the biggest media outlet in my region, or my, the Utica surrounding area. They're interested in sending me down here, right? Can I get a summer grant to cover my costs? They said, sure, great. You want to help publicize Utica College? By all means. So this is a lesson in, if you can figure out a scenario to get how wherever you want to go in a way that benefits a lot of people, right, and doesn't cost you any money, that's great. So I found myself on the floor of both conventions, reporting for WKTV, and this is really my beginning as a journalist in the area, and led to writing columns for the Observer-Dispatch, which is the major newspaper in Utica, both on the campaign and then on Trump's first 100 days. And the outgrowth of that was trying to not only share my related insights locally and regionally, but in a bigger format. And that's where the Center for Public Affairs and Election Research, which I developed, came about, and the website, which is the blogging portion of what I do. Right? It was nice and interesting, actually, over the last several months to sort of be recognized for my writing. And on television, it's a little strange if you're not used to that. And I thought, well, how can I reach more people? And that's where blogging came in. So that's a little bit about how a year ago I wasn't doing any of this, and then through my own interest, dedication to service, I ended up starting the center and having this blog. All right? So what I want to talk about in terms of why are three things. Benefits, why blogging that is. Benefits, attractions in regards to blogging, and downsides, because I want to be honest with you too. All right? So when we think about blogging, as I said, I spoke to some of you beforehand. I didn't speak with all of you. How many people have blogged before? Please raise your hand. Okay, some of us. When we think about the benefits of blogging, which some of you are familiar with, I think there are three that I'd like to focus on. Connection, communication, and creativity. All right? The fascinating thing I find about the digital age, as you're more acquainted with than I am, is the pace at which information can be transmitted. Right? So, with relative limited time, effort, you can connect with a large amount of people in a relatively short period of time through blogging. This center that I created operates, well, you can't see it, this is big. It operates on a platform called Squarespace. How many people have heard of Squarespace before? Okay, one of those. It's one of the major ones. All right, we'll advertise for Glenn. It's okay. It's no big deal. There are a couple of major platforms that basically you can create your own website. Even someone like me who has no experience doing that whatsoever, right, was able to do that. In an academic context, it cost $125 for the first year, and then the second year it'll be $250. So I got the college to pay for that. I have no other budget aside from that, right? But through that website, in just 4 months, I now have an audience that spans all 50 states and 80 different countries. All right? So when we think about the prospects of blogging and how you can take your thoughts, your research, your insights, and reach truly a global audience in a relatively short period of time, it is really quite possible to do that. The second C I mentioned was communication. Blogging has helped me tremendously in a couple of different ways in regards to communication. First is in terms of writing. Right? Having some experience now as a journalist, I use that term loosely. My journalist friends, I can say I can call myself a journalist. I'm still uncomfortable because I have no formal training in journalism. They said, you're doing journalism, you're a journalist. That's why the air quotes. Now, one of the things you learn in that capacity is working on a deadline. Right? Stories come out, and if you're writing, right, and you want to be as timely as possible, which we'll talk about in a minute, you have to learn how to write quickly. And you have to learn how to edit quickly and get your work out there quickly. You also have to write in a very powerful fashion. Right? With so many things out there, particularly in the digital space, if somebody's going to take time to read your piece, every sentence, every word has to be captivating enough for them to continue to scroll down and not go somewhere else. So what I'm trying to say is when I think about blogging, some of the advantages in regards to communication has definitely made me a much better writer. Right? And writing something that in my academic portfolio I think I've always done quite well, but it's even pushed me to new levels, which I greatly appreciate. The second consideration in terms of communication is communication with other people. Right? So part of what I do is recruit people who might want to write for us. Right? So that's easy at the start. Right? You lean on people that you know, that you think you might be a good fit. But at some point, you run out of your Rolodex, right? And you've got to expand another way. Right? And, don't worry about it. I want you to sit up there.
Oh, it'll time out in a second.
Oh, okay. So you have to learn how to communicate with other people who you don't know, right? Virtually, in terms of email, by phone, at conferences, right? And believe it or not, I'm actually a relatively shy person, right? I get very nervous before these types of things, even though this is the third or fourth talk I've done this week in a different context, right? So it took me a little bit of summoning courage and continuing to do that to sort of write people out of the blue and say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I do, would you be interested in doing that? Or going up to people who are well known nationally and internationally in journalism, in politics, and talk to them about what I do. So that's been helpful from a communication perspective, right? And the long and the short of that is you have nothing to lose, right? And the vast majority of the people are nice, right? They will treat you with respect even if they're not particularly interested in what you're doing. The other thing I've learned in regards to communication in that facet is when you think about sort of where your career goes from here and how you conduct yourself. Perhaps the best advice I can give you is that, and it sounds simple, but try to shrink your ego as much as possible, right? Because it often gets in the way of whatever it is you want to do, right? And just don't be a jerk, right? And it sounds simple. You look all like very nice people, right? But we've all had moments, myself included, right? Where we're tired and we're impatient. Maybe we say things or we do things that we regret. And if you do that in professional circles too much, and you take yourself too seriously and you think that you've got to prove how good you are to everybody else, and you come off as abrasive, people aren't going to like you and they aren't going to work with you, right? So it sounds simple, but particularly having 15 years now since I was in your position, it's one of the biggest things I've learned. And in the context of blogging in the center and trying to build an audience and trying to build a writing team, you very much have to be pleasant and professional all the time, or nobody's going to want to work with you, particularly when you're not paying them. So those are a couple things about communication. Third benefit I mentioned was creativity. Right? As a social science researcher, some of you are in the room as well, and with many of your fields are scientifically based, you know there are certain rules that you have to follow, very precise procedures in regards to research design and measurements and whatever it is you study. All that stuff's important. I'm an advocate for science, but at the same time, it's very tedious, it's very tiring, and it can be very frustrating, as you know. One of the nice things I think about blogging is that it loosens up that. Right? For what I do, I consider it data-driven. I consider it informed by political science. But if you click on any one of my posts, it's clearly not a political science article. It's not intended that way. It's not formatted that way. And while I enjoy doing political science work, I also find it very liberating that if there's a major development in American politics, as if there hasn't been any of those lately, right? I can sit down at my kitchen table, draw on my knowledge in the field, react in a very immediate way, post it, and have hundreds of people by the next morning reading my thoughts. Right? And if you're doing formal scientific research, of course, that's not the way it works. Right? And it allows you to be creative, to be spontaneous, and to do those types of things, which I value quite a bit. So those are some of the benefits. Now I'll talk about some of the attractions, some of these of which I've mentioned before. One, attractiveness of blogging, that is. Flexibility. Right? Unlike other professional commitments that you have, as you know, right? With blogging, you can do it when you want, how you want, whatever way you want, and it allows you a lot of flexibility. For me, that's helpful, right? Because I'm an active parent with 2 young children. I have a lot of different professional responsibilities that take up a whole chunk of my time. So, if I had to do this between 9 to 5, it just won't work. It's already filled with parental responsibilities and work responsibilities. So a lot of my blogging is very early in the morning, right? 3 to 7 a.m., right? Or very late at night, right? Like 9 to 2. And that's one attractive thing to me, because I can do it at my own time, right? Given anything else going on. Second thing that's attractive to me is scope, right? As I mentioned, I never would have thought that in a relatively short period of time, with zero experience in this realm, that what we'd be doing as a center would have reached 80 countries by now, right? That's just mind-boggling to me, and it's very gratifying, right? One of the nice things about, and there's computer science people in the room, so you know this a lot better than I do, about analytics now is that you can find out an incredible amount of information about who's reading your work, right? So you go on Google Analytics, or many of these sites, including Squarespace have their own analytics sections, right? And I can have detailed maps down to the town in far-off parts of the world, and their IP address, I don't get into that, of who's actually reading my work, at what time, how they're working their way through the site, all these types of things, right? So it's just a tremendous scope that you can have, and the ability to actually understand who your audience is tremendous. And again, as someone who wasn't well versed in that, I find it quite amazing. The pace of blogging is attractive as well, right? You get to come up with your own schedule. Now, I've talked to some of you, and I can relate to this. It's hard to stay on whatever schedule you might want to, because everything else gets in the way, right? That's totally understandable. But if you want to blog 3 times a day, you can. If you want to blog once a week, you can. If you want to blog once every 2 weeks, you can. That flexibility and the type of pace that you get to develop, I think, is very attractive to me. And then, as I mentioned before, cost, right? It's remarkable that you can do this at relatively minimal cost. Now, I understand as graduate students, a couple $100s a year is not insignificant, so I'm not trying to ignore that, right? But in the grand scheme of things, you know, being able to get your insights, your name, your background out to hundreds or thousands of people in a relatively short period of time at minimal cost is very attractive. All right, so that's the good news. The bad news, the downsides. Pay, all right? Most public discourse, that's the fancy name for blogging in political science, is not paid, right? Some of the more prominent sites do. I've got friends who write for 538, for instance, as prominent political science blog, is paid, but they're owned by Disney, so they got a ton of money to do a whole bunch of different things. That's kind of unique. The Monkey Cage, which is probably the most prominent political science blog, I had something published in there a few weeks ago. It's run out of George Washington University. It's now operated by the Washington Post. Right? They don't pay. Most people don't pay. So if you're looking to make money from blogging, it's probably not for you. On top of that, second point, in terms of downside, is criticism. Right? Once you put yourself out there in regards to whatever it is you're writing about, you can manage that in different ways. We don't allow comments directly at this point on our site. Maybe we will at some time. I wanted to kind of get a better feel of the landscape before I did that. But irrespective of that, you're going to get criticism. You can't please everybody all the time, particularly when you're someone like me, whose background's in politics and religion, right? So I'm accustomed to that dynamic, right? Also the journalistic work I mentioned earlier, where I would go on TV, I would write columns. I got used to people emailing me, many very supportive, others calling me very horrible names, right? And you have to figure out, one, are you comfortable with that, right? And that's not easy. And two, if you are, how are you going to deal with it, right? And for me, my approach is to be nice to everybody, at least once, right? So I write everybody back who writes me. That's very time consuming. But if I'm trying to build an audience and I'm trying to connect with people, and that's kind of the whole point, I'm going to take the time to do that. And the interesting thing I found is that even the people who said that I was some elite, bad name, out of touch professor who doesn't know anything, and made judgments about me, right? If I wrote them back and I said, hey, thanks for writing, I appreciate you reading my work, it's not very nice to call me those names. I don't know you, and I don't write you letters, you know, saying that you're an awful person and you don't know what you're doing professionally. You know, I'm happy to talk more about your thoughts, but maybe we can do that in a way that doesn't involve sort of what you just sent me. And believe it or not, 8 out of 10 people will go, yeah, you're right, that was kind of a jerk move, I shouldn't have done that. And sometimes they'll provide a rationale, like, hey, I was just trying to get your attention. And I'm like, hey, I said you could write me, so you had my attention, I gave you an invitation. And some of my critics are actually now, we correspond regularly, because you get over that. Now there is in my experience, roughly about 20% of people have no interest in going down that road, and that's fine. You were nice to them once, you thanked them, you held the high road, and you have to live with that, right? And different blogging sites in your field will have sort of different dynamics in terms of how that's going to go. I recently blogged for The Hill, which is a prominent publication / digital media site for political science. The comments there were not very nice. They're not very nice. They were predominantly negative. So that was, you read 40 of those and go, ooh, that hurts. But again, at the end of the day, you just have to figure out whether you're going to be comfortable with that. Some of it's actually funny. I'll share an anecdote from this morning. One of the pieces I wrote about on Washington Post site, somebody told me to sod off, Luke, you pseudo-intellectual. And I didn't know what that was. So this morning, I'm asking my wife over breakfast, I said, do you know what sod off means? Is that British? Does that mean like go K-I-L-L yourself? And I had to spell it because my 3-year-old was there. And she goes, I don't think it's British, I don't know. So, you know, if you have a sense of humor about it too, it helps as well. But you have to understand there's going to be criticism, you can't please everybody, and you got to, you know, go with your eyes open on that. And then the last downside is that it's work, right? If I probably gave it more thought in terms of what creating a center like this and a site that does blogging and running it like a digital media company, what that actually entails, I might not have actually done it. Because it's a good 20 to 30 hours a week on top of my regular work that I devote to that. Now you don't have to do that, but I'm the kind of person that I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it all the way, and I'm going to, you know, want to give it my best. So when we do think about blogging, if it is something you're interested in, depending on how ambitious you are, how much time you have, how engaged you are, you do understand that at times, to do it to the level that you want to, it can feel like work. All right? So that's a little bit of the why blogging is helpful in terms of benefits, attractions, and downsides. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how, and then I'll shut up and take your questions. I'm going to provide some general considerations in regards to how, because I appreciate that the vast majority of you are not political scientists here, so I'll just share some things that I picked up in regards to thinking about this in terms of what works for me. Hopefully they're applicable to your fields. And then I'll give you some practical suggestions that might be helpful should this be something you want to more seriously engage. The first general consideration I'll raise is being grounded, right? So I know that there's probably concern, particularly in the digital age, of putting yourself out there, how that might hurt you potentially in a job search or another professional capacity, and you need to be realistic about that. I think the best way to avoid that is to make sure that whatever it is you're blogging about is grounded in sound analysis that's appropriate for your field. Right? If you're looking at a blog as just an opportunity to go off on whatever it is you want to go off on, it's probably not going to help you professionally, it's probably going to hurt you. But if you're taking your training, your research, your expertise that you've been developing, and you put that into something that's concise and readable for a general audience, right? You know, I can't make you any guarantees, but it's most likely not going to get you in any trouble. And I understand, particularly at this point in your careers, why that's an important consideration. For me, I actually never thought too much about it, right? I just decided this is what I'm going to do, and it's worked pretty well for me to make sure that whatever it is I'm writing about is grounded in my background and my expertise, and I'm making clear that I'm writing as a political scientist, right? Not writing as Luke, some guy in New York who has opinions, all right? So that's, I think, an important practical consideration should you want to start doing this. Now, in terms of building an audience, if you're going down the road of blogging, being timely, of course, is very important, right? One of the funny things about being an academic is that you develop this very, very narrow expertise in something that most people know little about, right? And somehow you've got to explain it to everybody else in a way that they care about and they understand, right? So when you're doing that in terms of blogging, it's important to try to connect your expertise to current events, right? And making sure that that connection is pretty clear, right? Now, if there's some fields that's going to be easier than others. Obviously, in American politics, my expertise is elections, right? So we have fixed elections in this country. I'm all set, right? But in terms of your fields, it's going to be different. But you always want to be thinking about who cares, right? You care, but you got to make sure other people care too, right? And then you also, have to think about why should they care about this now, all right? So in terms of orientation about blogging in regards to your respective fields, I keep that in mind. Along those lines, thirdly, the hook's important, right? I have a lot of colleagues around the world that write. Less of the problem with them, but when I work with some graduate students and particularly undergraduate students, some of whom write for the site, they have great ideas, right? But they're not able to wrap that up in a package, in a hook, and make it clear to an audience why that's something they should read. So you want sort of particularly a good title, right, that clearly intrigues someone to read your piece. All right. Fourthly, thinking about general considerations, you want to be as engaged as possible in building your audience. Right. Coming up with good content is very important. It's a solid foundation, but it's only half the battle. Right. You can work really hard coming up with great pieces, But if 5, 10, 15 people read it, that's not really what you're trying to get at, right? So thinking creatively about ways to build your audience is really important. Now, I'll share briefly the model that we adopted with the center, and it's not a highly revolutionary model. The niche that we're going for is the idea that there are a lot of elite political scientists, and we'll stick with political scientists, who write for blogs, like some of the ones I referenced, the Monkey Cage, for instance. But there are also tens of thousands of other political analysts, pundits, political scientists who have PhDs or advanced degrees and do very good work, who aren't going to get to the monkey cage in that top 5%, right? And what we're trying to do is build a network of political scientists around the country and around the world who fall into that realm, where currently, maybe they're not at the very top tier in regards to blogging, but they have something important to say. They're good writers, they have good insights. And so we're building an audience in part by trying to build a global writing team, right, of PhDs, journalists, and government practitioners who or maybe for the first time getting into this, or their careers in blogging are ascending, and we're providing them an outlet to do that. Now, the residual benefit for our audience is that the more people you have writing from different parts of the country and the different parts of the world, the more audience bases you have, right? So the Huffington Post, in regards to politics, really was sort of, in some ways, at the forefront of this, but they get criticized because they pretty much let anybody write on there, right? And that raises concerns about quality control. So we're looking to try to find a balance between being very inclusive to related professionals, right, but at the same time make sure that the content is where we want, and that helps build the audience, right? You also want to think creatively, particularly when you have no budget like me, about how to draw people to your site. So one thing I've been toying with recently is using the comments on the digital edition of the Washington Post, right, to help share my work. People who read the Washington Post, those are the type of people I would like to read my articles, right? So I have the digital subscription to the Washington Post. I have an account. I put my real name up there. I'm a political scientist, Utica College, right? And when journalists from the Washington Post write something that relates to something that we've written about, I put a sentence or two in the comment board. I said, if you want to read more, here you go, right? I did that last night, for instance, in terms of this piece about Mike Pence. Obviously, the big talk in American politics is about the brouhaha in terms of President Trump and potential obstruction of justice and whether he's going to be impeached. And this was inspired many of my liberal friends to say, well, you know, Republicans really prefer Pence anyways. And I heard that so much that I thought to myself, you know, I'm not comfortable with that assessment. And so I wrote a short piece about it, and I jumped onto the countless articles that you've been on the Washington Post website about Trump and what's been happening the last couple of days, right? And I was able to pull 1,000 readers from the Washington Post over to my article, right, through that simple process. It didn't cost me anything. It didn't take me a lot of time, right? And I'm connecting with people who are exactly the type of people I want. Who I would say, is a prominent newspaper, so they're reading a prominent newspaper, they're doing it in a digital fashion, and they probably care a good bit about politics if they're taking time to read comments in surrounding articles, all right? So when you think about building an audience, from a general marketing perspective, you might say, well, I gotta get an advertising budget, and I gotta spend all this money. If you're creative and you constantly think about new ways to engage your audience, right, you can do that in a way that doesn't cost you anything, can be effective, all right? So those are some general considerations. Be grounded, be timely, have a good hook, and always think about how to engage your audience. I'll share 3 practical suggestions. If you're kind of saying to yourself, well, maybe I'll do this, but really, like, what do I do next, kind of thing, right? First, I would definitely make sure you have social media accounts that you use in a professional capacity. How many people do? Okay, some of us, but not most of us. For me, I had never been on Twitter as of June of last year, right? Just didn't interest me. I'll leave it at that. Didn't interest me. I mentioned my journalist work. I mentioned the TV station, right? I get off there once. The program director says, you really need a Twitter account. If you had one, we tweet the hell out of you. And I said, all right. So as one of the conditions of going down to the conventions, they said, we'd like you to please create a Twitter account, tweet about what you're doing. So as I mentioned, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to go all in. So I did a lot of tweeting, and now I do it as a professional endeavor, right? So I was down at the conventions. I tweeted a whole bunch of different stuff about that. I was not only interviewing members of government, interviewing presidential candidates, because that's a crazy thing, right? About being at a party convention. It's a very exclusive undertaking to get in there, but when you get in there, it's just hundreds of reporters walking around looking for people to talk to, right? And it's really not hard to talk to people. Talk to all kinds of people. So Twitter is a great way, right? If you interview Newt Gingrich or you interview, Bob Corker, those are two examples of people I interviewed prominent in the news. You say, hey, I just talked to this person about this, and then boom, you send it out there and you build an audience. Then of course, when you're blogging, you use that also as a means to help promote the different articles that you're using. So I would strongly encourage you to consider, particularly Twitter, as a way to help promote yourself professionally. Why Twitter? Because older people like myself are more likely to be on Twitter than Snapchat or Instagram or some of the other things that my undergraduate students tell me they're on all the time, right? So you might not think Twitter is cool or hip or any of those types of things, but older people that you're trying to get attention from are on there. I mean, the general rule of thumb in government, particularly in members of Congress, is that Twitter is used to connect with journalists, right? And Facebook is used to connect with constituents. Second practical suggestion related to this is to have your own website, right? I know this, I've hired people before, new PhDs included, right? And if I can hop on a professional website that's well designed and can give me a sense of who this person is, even before I decide to interview them or after I interview them, if I'm interested in them, right? And I could have links to their work and understand what they're doing. I find all that very helpful, right? Again, you want it to be clean, you want it to be professional looking, and again, it doesn't cost that much, but it's a way to help promote yourself. Now, if you've gone on WordPress or Squarespace and created your own site, right? One thing you need to do in terms of blogging is post regularly. You can come up with whatever schedule you want, but if you really want to build an audience, they're going to anticipate you publishing in a certain sequence. So for me with the center, we were originally publishing once a week, then we went to every other day, then we went to every day, and probably this summer we're going to go at least twice a day. So give some thought about whatever it is you're comfortable with, and I would suggest doing it more sparingly at first, maybe like once every other week or once a week, and then once you get that, you can ramp it up. It's always harder to dial it back, right? Particularly when you build an audience who is accustomed to reading certain things at certain times. All right. So for me, I post usually I post at least every morning. So our readers know that when they wake up, so I got small kids, I'm probably up before them, right? That they can go ahead and go onto our site, and they'll see a new piece there every day. All right. Fourth and last consideration, and perhaps the most important, don't be shy. Right? Again, I spoke earlier about how I'm inherently shy and I have to muster up courage in a bunch of different situations. I also don't like sales. I never like the idea of networking, like promoting, meeting people just to promote yourself, to advance your career. I don't like sales. My father's a salesman. He's great at it. The idea of selling something to people just makes me very uncomfortable. I've learned that selling things and networking don't necessarily have to be uncomfortable things for me, right? If I think about it in terms of sharing. If I have something that I think might be of interest to other people, it's worth sharing that. Even more generally, just getting to know somebody and creating a relationship doesn't have to always be about getting something out of it. And so, when you think about getting started with blogging, whether you're emailing people or whether you have an opportunity to meet somebody who's significant in your respective field, don't be shy. Introduce yourself, say this is who you are. Start with creating a relationship, and as it looks like they might be interested in something you're doing, share it. Right? And I can provide some brief anecdotes of interesting people that I've met that way. Dan Balls, for example. Does anybody know who Dan Balls is? Great, I picked someone you don't know. He's a senior political columnist for the Washington Post, right? He's probably one of their most prestigious writers. He's also been honored by the Professional Association for Political Science, right? He's received significant awards in that regard. So he's really kind of the big deal in the small little world in which I deal with. I got to know Dan Balls a little bit by not being shy, right? So I keep referencing the convention because this is when all it started for me. But at the conventions, the newspapers rent out restaurants, which they basically commandeer for weeks at a time. And you go up to them and they say it's exclusive, right? And you get the impression that's only for Washington Post people. I had a couple friends there that said, hey, you don't actually have to be in the Washington Post, you just got to sign up and get in there. So you get in there, so that's the first case, don't be shy. The sign says it's exclusive, try to figure out if there's another way to get in there. So I find my way into Washington Post headquarters, and I get to hang out there during the conventions, which is great, because it's craft brewery, so they have free beer and free food all the time, which if you're on a limited budget and you like beer, it's a good thing. But professionally, the benefit is that there's a lot of interesting people floating around there, right? I mean, this is sort of a center point for government and politics, particularly American politics, at the time. So they're having regular events with members of Congress. So I met Cory Booker, senator from New Jersey. I met Chuck Schumer, right, Senate Minority Leader, a whole bunch of other senators who were coming and going. And I also got to meet prominent journalists like Dan Balz. And we're all kind of geeky. That's why we're here, right? So there are people in your field who you look at and you're like, oh, this is a celebrity to me. And Dan Balz was kind of that guy. And so it took me a good couple of days sizing him up at the food aisle, right? Sort of doing one of these, like, should I, shouldn't I kind of thing. And ultimately I went up to him and said, hey, Mr. Balz, I like your work. And I was curious because he had interviewed Donald Trump and I hadn't, obviously. And I wanted to get his take on what interviewing Donald Trump was like. So I had a legitimate question that I wanted to ask him. You want to be quick and concise, these people are busy. Super nice guy, right? And he answers my questions, it's nice to meet you. And along the lines of the theme, don't be shy, that was just a starting point, right? So if you've introduced yourself to someone who's prominent in your field, you want to look for other opportunities to follow that up so that person knows who you are. So I had an opportunity to go out to Vegas surrounding one of the presidential debates. I also had the opportunity to attend a Washington Post event. One of the things that I deliberately wanted to do was make sure I talked to Dan Balz, right? Which I was able to do on the red carpet. It sounds very fancy. Because, right, the more that somebody can remember who you are, the more likely, right, they are to connect with you in different ways. So that's one sort of geeky story in regards to how I wasn't shy, and I'm grateful for it because somebody who I really admired turned out to be a great person, and it shows how just sort of connecting with people can provide interesting insights for you and be rewarding. Second quick example, also the Washington Post, a columnist by the name of Amber Phillips. This is a little secret I'll share with you. I recently was promoted and tenured, and now I'm sort of the full professor, which is just about the highest rank in my college as I could be. And of course, the way my crazy mind works, I said, well, maybe I'll do something else now. And so I'm having this moment where I went through all this journalistic stuff, and I've been down in DC a lot. It's really exciting. And I'm reading a Washington Post newsletter called The Fix. It's written by a journalist named Amber Phillips. And at the end of it, she says, hey, if you want to drop me a line, go ahead. So me, I take that literally, right? I write Amber Phillips. My hook was, is this crazy? That's what I put in the headline. And I said, I'm thinking of quitting my job and working for the Washington Post because while I love teaching, being a professor, I think I went on about why I was attracted to journalism and why I might want to do a career change. She wrote me back in 10 minutes, right? And she said, no, that's not crazy. And she wrote me this very nice email, was also this very kind person. And now we've exchanged several emails, right? From that very moment of not being shy. And when my piece was published in the Monkey Cage, which is something she suggested I pursue, I dropped her a line and just said, hey, I just wanted to thank you a lot. You were really kind to me earlier. And she said, oh, this is great news. I'm going to have to promote it. So she tweets it to her thousands of followers. And more people are, hopefully exposed to my work. So those are just two quick examples, and I could go on about how if you're just yourself and you don't let the moment get too big for you, with whoever it is that you admire and want to be like, right? If you take the plunge, chances are they're going to be a nice person. And you don't have to sell yourself. You can just introduce yourself, say what you're interested in, maybe ask a pertinent question, show that you're interested in their work, and who knows where that's going to lead. Now, it doesn't always work out well. I introduced myself to Charlie Rose. Does anybody know who Charlie Rose is? Yeah, he wasn't so nice, which was fine. It was good. I needed a good smack in the face with this type of thing as well. But 9 out of 10 times, people are going to be nice, and they're going to give you a few minutes. So I'd like to give you a few minutes now and ask some questions about anything at all that might be helpful to you as we approach this topic. Yes, sir?
One question, looking at your posts are not long.
No.
They're a couple paragraphs each. How did you decide on how long you wanted to write, and is that the magic length, or just your process on how you decided on that extent of writing?
Thanks for your question. So one thing I learned in communicating with Amber Phillips is that even on the Washington Post site, I mean, they get only a small percentage of people who actually work their way through the entire article, and they can measure that. I can't actually measure who reads all our articles. So I wanted something that was substantive enough where people felt like their time was being used well, but that they were more likely than not to finish the article. So I don't have the set word, limit on that. I mean, we kind of shoot for about 500 words. But personally, and some of it's just preference, I mean, I really like the letter to the editor. Because good writing is really rewriting, right? And I had a friend and colleague, Julia Zari at Marquette University, who also writes for 538 and Vox, and she's looked at some of my stuff. She says, you know what? Somebody told me long ago, you can just cut the first paragraph or whatever it is you're writing, it's going to be better. And there's some truth to that. So, I like the idea of sort of really getting something really tight, really word by word, sentence for sentence. Now, I'm not, of course, saying that we pull that off on every post, but personally, that's what I shoot to do. I'll start with something longer, and then usually a third of it's gone by the time I publish it. And now I'm a couple of my posts, particularly with this column I've created, Sound Off. I'm getting some pushback where it's too short, where it's like, hey, this is like 200 words. Why did you have something more substantive? So you're kind of always walking that line. But if I'm around 400 to 700 words, I'm generally happy. And I like with the Sound Off to try to create like a shorter alternative. And I need to, I think, communicate a little more up front. This is going to be just a short snippet of an idea, so readers know what they're in for. What do you like to read in terms of length in something like this?
I think it's a great length. It is shorter than, I sometimes go to blogs with a bit of dread because it's almost impossible to get through them. And I've read a number of yours just while you were talking. And
thanks. Better than not reading them at all.
They're concise, and you get to the end, and you don't feel bored by the time you get to the end. So I'm just interested and intrigued.
Yeah, so that's kind of what we're shooting for, but it's a fluid process, And I don't like the term dumbing it down, because I don't think shorter is necessarily dumber or more simplistic. It's just more concise. But you also don't want it so concise where it's just like a thought and there isn't substance to it. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
This is a real beginner question, but you create a blog, you put something on the internet, and then how do you get anybody to read it for the first time? You start with, I was going to say you start somewhere, but you start nowhere, kind of. How do you go from zero?
Well, that's a good question. So the first thing you do is when you post on a site like this, you have tags that you can put with the article. Do you mind maybe just clicking on one of those? Anyone will be fine. And scroll down to the bottom. I think that's where our tags are. Oh, I'm sorry. Just click on one of the posts and then scroll down to the bottom. That one. All right, get right there. So it's kind of small, but you can see here. So for every post, you get to put tags on that post. The computer science people are familiar with this. I wasn't that familiar with it. But when you do this, it helps drive searches towards your site, right? And the tags that you want to use should be proper nouns, right? Because people who are interested in something specific are not going to search, law enforcement if they're interested in, a specific incident related to the FBI director. So you can see. This one has intelligence porn. That's a quote. I wasn't taking liberties there. James Comey used that phrase. He's the fired FBI director in his testimony before he was fired. Felt like I needed to clarify that. Anyhow, so we've got proper nouns, right? People, places, things, all these types of things. And that's how people who go to Google, right, might come across your stuff that way. Secondly, that's where social media comes in, right? Twitter in particular, it's really not hard to build a Twitter following. I've got a couple thousand followers. I don't know a couple thousand people, right? So how do you do that? Thank you. Appreciate that. Call you back. It's connecting, for me, like on Twitter, I'm trying to connect in a professional capacity with other professors in political science who are, you can kind of look, it depends on your field. What's your field? English. Okay, so it depends sort of who you're marketing to, or but I look for other political scientists. I'm looking for not just anybody, but people who also say like, hey, I'm a professor at this college, and this is my area of specialty, and I'll follow those people. And the way Twitter generally works is if They follow you, you follow them, and then before you know it, you got a couple thousand people. So then when you blog something, right, you just say, hey, just here's my latest, and you have a link to it, and then you're going to get some clicks going through it that way. Now, so those are the two simple ways to get started. If you want to be more ambitious, and we started doing this at the center, a lot of digital media companies, particularly related to politics, do email bulletins as well. Bulletins is kind of a dated term, but I don't even know what to call it properly. But basically, and if you read the Post or the Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Hill or Politico, these are all sort of major political publications, they've got these things you can sign up for, right? And every day they're going to email you a little synopsis of what's going on with the day, and then it's got all links to the stuff. So for the center, we do something like that as well. We did it once a week, and then I saw that it was drawing people regularly, and then now we do it twice a week. Right, and so what we do is just, we do it on Sunday and Monday. We provide some original content, so it's not just, hey, read our stuff. But then it also provides sort of a one-sentence synopsis of here's the articles that we had, right, with the name, the professional affiliation, the blurb, and then linked right in there, read here, and they can click on it. And that's another nice way, because if maybe people aren't going to venture out to your actual site, but if you send them an email and they kind of like what you do and they're just scrolling through and they have a few minutes to say, oh, this looks interesting, and they'll click on it. So does that help in terms of a couple suggestions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Photos and fair use. I see that you're not using the photos that you took and you're using from archives. And how does that go for you? I know that Getty can be touchy about their images being reshared. Do you purchase the images from Getty, or
No.
are you rolling the dice here?
Well, that's a good question. So I do actually put some of my own images up there that I've taken, but most of them are not, so you're correct. I cite everything I possibly can, and you can see, if you want to click back, for just about each of the cover images, I'll credit the photo by AP, photo by Business Insider. So I do that, so I'm trying to provide credit in the general realm of sort of being an academic that's trying to steal people's intellectual property. Also I have a page that's about us. I say very clearly that all the images that are being used here are used for educational purposes, right? Which I think, I don't know if it would stand up in court, but from a legal perspective, so I'm told if you're using images for educational purposes, there's certain latitude in regards to being able to transmit those without actually paying for them. So from a practical perspective, yeah, if Getty or AP was unsatisfied with how I handled that in terms of my disclaimer that they're for educational purposes, I'm not profiting off this, and we don't charge anybody for any content. And if crediting wasn't sufficient, maybe they could send me an email and say, hey, stop using our images. That hasn't happened yet. If they get big enough where they care about it, then that would kind of make me happy. But in all sincerity, I'm not trying to steal people's creative work. I'm trying to, the way I look at it is I'm using it in an academic type of context. I'm trying to credit it, and I'm trying to make it very clear that this is for educational purposes, not for profit.
Do you think the fact that that this is for an institute helps make that educational claim? And do you think this would be different for, say, a personal or individual blog?
Well, it all depends on your mission, right? So if you've got your own individual blog, you could put into your mission that, one of the things you're trying to do is to share insight and analysis on insert field, right? And all the contents and written and photos are towards that end. So I don't know the extent to which being tied with a college would cover me for that. But I think, as a professional in an academic setting, right, if you make clear, particularly within your mission, and anybody calls you on it, you can say, hey, this is what we're trying to do, and this is sort of how we're doing it. Thanks. Uncomfortable silence. So what are some general reactions to the things that I've said? Are you more inclined to consider doing this or less inclined? Please be honest, it doesn't matter to me either way. Anybody want to share?
One thing that's funny is you asked, is anybody doing a blog, and I didn't raise my hand, and I remembered later that I am.
Okay.
So, it reminds me that I should do that.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to find the time, right? I mean, you're all busy with graduate work and trying to support yourself and trying to have a social life. One thing I didn't mention is that once you get into a rhythm, the more you do it, the less time it takes. Right? I mean, I know that just from writing, and you probably experienced this in some capacity as well, right? The more you do scholarly analysis, the less time it takes to get from A to B. And it's similar for this. So, when I started out, it would take me longer to write and to edit and to figure out what I wanted to do. Now I know what I want to do. I've done it a bunch. So when I have an idea, like I did drive an over here, I jot it down in a notebook, and I can write a piece in 20 minutes if I want to. So maybe that's a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of time and maybe getting back into it. Like anything else, practice helps you with that. I'd be interested in, honestly, I'm talking about political science because that's what I know. Does anybody want to share in their fields sort of what blogging looks like or what some of the general trends are?
Yeah, so in our one of our courses, we are technology integration in educational settings, and so our students need to have this blog, and they will blog one technology product they like, and they will introduce them, and they will share how they will use them in their own classroom, and so they update once a week, and they need also to comment on their peers' blog.
Mhm.
And we found some students that are really into this blog thing. They have long piece and they have pictures and they link videos and other sources. And some other students that seems not very into this blog and they just put like several words there. And several weeks later they say, I have nothing to say about my technology product. Yeah, so we are thinking how we can design this blog activity to let students to have a better experience of using a blog. And also the other thing I feel kind of frustrating is some of the WordPress, this platform. So the default setting is that you need to moderate the comment part. So and some students, so one student leave a comment to the other students, and the other student didn't read and approve that, so the comments never showed up. And so students will are not very motivated to comment on each other.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so we have some of our classes at Utica College undergraduate courses in which they have to blog, and it's similar things. I think fortunately we're getting a lot with undergrads saying, well, geez, I didn't like the idea at first, but now I'm doing it. It's actually helpful in a lot of different ways. I think that's a growing trend. It's an interesting sort of challenge in terms of making that work. Your comment made me think of two suggestions that also might be helpful to consider. When people comment on your blog, it's great to have a dialogue with them, right? Because particularly if that's linked to social media, every time somebody says something, it's going to be retransmitted out and about, so people are more likely to read your stuff. Second, if looking through my site or similar sites, you see that things are hyperlinked, right? So nearly every one of our articles references other works with a hyperlink. This is helpful in a couple of different ways. One, if we actually get enough traffic where we're pulling people to the Washington Post and New York Times and they notice they like it, they might be willing to help us out in certain ways. We're not at all near that, so I'm not trying to speak out of turn, but it's something to keep in mind. And then on the flip side, one of the things that was suggested to me by the person who used to run a digital media company, is a professor at my college who's been helping me with this, was that if you can get your article into a more prominent blog and have it hyperlinked, you can pull traffic in your direction, right? So we had one of my colleagues spends most of the year in France, and he's a political scientist who writes about France, and as you may know, they had an interesting election, so he was writing about it. Somehow we came across Smithsonian Magazine, right? They linked his article, the article that he wrote for us, and so then we got hundreds of clicks through based on that article. Right? And I've been able to do that with some, that's another in terms of meeting people, right? You meet people, you introduce yourself, they find out what you're working on, they say, hey, can I learn more about that? You direct them to your blog post on it, and if they're a blogger, they'll say, hey, can I link to that? That just happened to me with Seth Maskett from the University of Denver, who had the opportunity to meet not too long ago. The thing I didn't tell Seth was that I hadn't actually written down the blog post yet, but I knew he was a fairly prominent political scientist and blogger, and if I sent him something through our site, he just might link it in whatever it is he was working on, and he did, and it was helpful. So thank you very much for sharing. Those are some things that came to mind in relation to that.
Yeah, I'm in religious studies, and federated blogs are very popular. So the LA Review of Books has a channel that does religious studies, that does really great content, and a lot of people have awesome people write for them. And the journals have started doing blogs. One that I think of is the Bulletin for the Study of Religion. Equinox is the publisher, and they run they have a blog that's attached to it that they get a lot of people writing for. And there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of there, and the journal sees it as a way of driving traffic to journal articles sitting behind a paywall, but I doubt that actually happens, because instead we wind up using that content in our classes, because they do blog posts about what's in your syllabus and what are your approaches to pedagogy, theory and method for the field, and then takes on various topics. And so those are very common in a lot of things.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. So it's kind of similar. It's not so much the journals in political science have their own blogs, but political science is divided into one national professional association and then 4 major regional ones. And the Western Political Science Association has recently developed a blog that is a nice way, again, particularly if you're a graduate student, to distinguish yourself. You get out there. It's not a bad start. So we're starting to see that in my field a little bit in terms of at the professional association level. And I think it's only a matter of time. If one of the semi-major ones do it, other ones are going to do it, and then it's going to kind of take off. So it's kind of interesting. It's sort of the beginning of a new trend there. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
All right.
Yeah. When we come out of the hole.
You already had tenure before you started doing this, right?
Technically, yeah, about the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of the legibility of this kind of activity professionally, like in terms of tenure and promotion,
Yeah.
or is your time better spent doing the research publications and the more kind of conventional sort of output? Like thinking of it in terms of the career trajectory and specifically this idea.
That's a great question. So I think the short answer, it depends on sort of where you're at and what type of institution that is and what they expect. So obviously you want to focus as tightly as possible on what that is. Right? If you're a published or parish institution, prominent R1, they're probably going to expect 1 or more books, right, and scholarly articles. Again, they vary per field, and they're probably less interested in this type of public discourse. So I think it's a good point. Once you get out of that realm, though, I mean, if you work at a regional university, as I have, or a small liberal arts college, public or private, I've worked at both, then it really differs. But if you're going to spend a lot of time on something like this, I think, and particularly if you're tenure track, it's definitely worth discussing that with whether your mentors are, your department chair is, and say, hey, this is something I'd like to do. How does this potentially fit in regards to my evaluations annually for promotion and for tenure? At the very least, it should count for service. And depending on the institution, you might get some credit for research. It's most likely not going to replace doing academic research. But I know from experience that presidents, vice presidents, provosts, they like publicity, right? They like people's names in places where other people in your college aren't there. So if you're able to get yourself into the Washington Post or whatever would be appropriate for your field, even though that might not directly help you in regards to pursuing promotion and tenure, it certainly helps ingratiate you with the, that's a little unfair, I was going to call them the money people, but the people who are or have more concerns that are beyond academic, because free publicity is usually good publicity, particularly when you get to a high level that maybe your institution doesn't usually see. Does that answer your question? What do you think? I'm interested in your thoughts. Yeah, regards to your question, yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's certainly fluid. It's certainly in motion. More and more people are blogging, and certainly, like you're pointing to, kind of the public imprint. You have the capacity to get your name out there, which has an effect on your reputation, even if that isn't codified, let's say, in a faculty manual. Here are the things that you're going to be judged on for tenure. I think it's kind of difficult for the people in your department who might be tasked with reviewing your tenure and promotion dossier to simply ignore the fact that you have kind of a public brand of your own. On the other hand, I think the way that they look at that might vary a lot from person to person. Some of them could think it's really cool, and some of them could think this is not what scholarship is.
Yeah.
So I think you kind of have to know who your people are, for one thing, and like anything else, just be sensible about how you kind of the relative priority that you attach to these different kinds of things in light of your career goals.
Well, I think it's a great point. Certainly, it won't replace whatever your research expectations are. And for me personally, I mean, I hadn't given it that much thought, But I had written, for my institution, if you have 3 scholarly articles, it's good. If you have a book, it's great. So I had 5 scholarly articles and 2 books. So, at some point, I kind of said, okay, I'm not going to worry about this. And not that I wasn't taking my career seriously, but I felt like I had fulfilled what I needed to fulfill. I wasn't particularly concerned about it. But no, it's certainly something to think about. Now, I'm happy to answer more questions, but I don't want to run late because I know you're running a tight schedule here. Should we take more questions, or should that be individual?
Let's take one more question,
Okay.
and then,
Have you thought of adding peer review? Because one of the things that's popular in religious studies is departmental blogs that have peer review attached to them to help people with what Lynn is bringing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of part of what you do when you're in this kind of stuff is sort of get where you want to go and then think about, okay, where do we go next? And so one potential thought that's been suggested to me, and I think is a good one, is to sort of have a separate magazine, journal, whatever you want to call it, it's not even in existence yet, related to the center, that would be sort of like a cut above, a little more exclusive than what we would author here. And it would kind of be a little more in between, sort of just a raw blog post and something that's peer reviewed. And I think potentially in 6 months we might have something like that. And it's this time, right? So it's how would I go about doing that? How would I put together a team of peer reviewers and all these types of things? I've worked on journals before. It's a ton of work. But I think it's a great idea. And it's also a way to kind of take sort of the blog as is and then have multiple levels of it that might contribute to some of the types of things that you were referencing. Well, I want to thank you all very much for your time and attention this afternoon. And I'm happy to